begging you, I plead. Read, read, read. I was in New York in October when Hurricane Sandy hit, and I went to Long Beach, a devastated community on the South Shore of Long Island, and people were in a state of shock, walking around the neighborhoods, having no place to live, many of them in shelters. No one had power. The Long Beach Public Library was shut down because it had taken on water. And somebody in that organization decided to take the books out before they got moldy and put them on school buses and send those buses out into the community, parked at strategic locations. And so a reporter for the New York Times was in the area, and a woman came off of one of those buses, and the reporter asked her what she was doing there. And she said, "I've lost everything, and I'm staying in shelter. And I come here because the bus has heat, first of all, and secondly, because here I can get a book, and I stay here until I read myself happy." Such is the power of story. Now, today's story I call The Hand of Love. Once upon a time, when pigs spoke rhyme, and ants could dance, and bees had knees, and cats wore hats, and kids wore wigs, and monkeys smoked tobacco, something I hope none of you will ever do. And rats ate stuff to make them tough. Let me see those muscles out there. There you go. Thank you. The leader. And ducks went quack, quack, quack. Once upon a time, there was a boy named William who lived with his parents in a cabin just outside of town in Montana, which means mountain in Spanish. Stories are educational. I like the ones that teach you here and reach you here the best. So, in the early 1900s, before vaccinations were invented or antibiotics, if the yellow fever, malaria, came to your area, many thousands of people would die. And so it was with William's parents, one after the other. At the funeral, the relatives bickered about who William would come to live with. He was only 5 years old. And they went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, city, country. And finally, grandfather, who was a 6'4" Native American Cherokee, standing off to the side, said, "Let the boy decide." And William looked at all of his relatives, and they looked back at him, and he walked over and took his grandfather by the hand. And so it was decided that William would live with his grandfather and grandmother, both Native American, Cherokee. And so they began their long journey towards their cabin on Bear Paw Mountain in northern Montana. And on way, William began to receive an education such as he had never had before. He was about to learn the way, the Native American philosophy of life. First off, grandfather said, "From this day on you shall be called Little Tree." And then grandfather said, "The first thing you must know is that when something good happens, you must share it with whoever you can find. And then there's no telling how far it will spread." The second thing is that you must take no more than you need. If we are hunting for deer, we take the deer that is slowest and smallest so that the species will be strong and survive and provide us with food for many more years to come. He said, when we see the family of quail happily pecking about the oak tree, and the hawk swoops down out of the sky, and the birds scatter, and yet the slowest cannot escape, and the hawk clutches that quail in its claws, takes it away for dinner. We must not be sad, because we must realize that the slow quail will breed slow children, thus weakening the species. The hawk also takes 1,000 ground rats a year, and it is the ground rats that eat the quail eggs. And so the hawk is friend to the quail. Grandpa explained that in nature, only the bee takes more and stores more than it needs. And that is why the coons, the bear, and the Cherokee rob him. For this part, I'd like to come down a little closer. I hope this microphone is working.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Little Tree also learned how to hand fish. Now, in Montana, July and August, it's very hot. The creek water is not enjoyable for the catfish to swim in. And so the catfish have figured out that if they go to the side of the creek bank and make a little hole in the creek bank, they can stay in there in the heat of the day and be cool. And then later on, when the sun goes down, they can return to the creek and resume their swimming about. So that if Grandpa and Little Tree lay down on their chests and hung over the riverbank, they could feel for these holes. And if they found the hole, then they knew that the fish would be in there. And Little Tree learned that if you rub the belly of the catfish very gently, they would stand perfectly still. And then you could grab it by its gills and by its tail and take it out. And that was hand fishing. And Little Tree enjoyed it very much. One day, they were hand fishing about 20 feet apart from each other. And Little Tree was excited because he had found the hole. Then he found the catfish. He was rubbing its belly, preparing to pull it out of the water, when he heard a whirring sound. Loud and still. And he looked up, and there was a rattlesnake, not 6 inches from his face. The rattlesnake had red eyes, barely open, like slits, and a long black tongue that came out so close to Little Tree's face that it was maybe an inch away. Little Tree knew that he was being sensed and that the rattlesnake would soon strike. And even though he knew that, he was paralyzed with fear. He could not move. And he just stood still. Meanwhile, he heard a faint rustle behind him and a voice, soft as sugar. And as if he were talking about the weather, Grandpa said, "Don't move. Don't breathe." And then a hand came between the rattlesnake and Little Tree's face. And the rattler raised itself up high and moved its head back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And Little Tree knew that he was deciding where to strike. And finally, like a speeding bullet, smashed its head into Grandpa's hand. But that hand did not move. Steady as a rock, it remained in place, protecting Little Tree's face. And Little Tree saw the fangs buried deep into Grandpa's hand. And still that hand did not move. Grandpa took out his other hand and slowly moved it up toward the center, and then grabbed it by the neck and the back of the head and squeezed and squeezed and squeezed with every fiber of strength that he had in his body. And Little Tree could not take his eyes off his grandfather's muscles, which appeared to be bursting right through his shirt. And then finally he heard a snap and a crack. Broken the snake's neck. Threw the snake down. And he fell to his knees. He took out his knife and he cut into where those fangs had gone in. And he immediately began to suck and spit and suck and spit and suck and spit out the blood and poison. Fell to his knees. And now the sweat was pouring off of him. His hand had swollen up to the size of his leg. And he said to Little Tree, "Well, I guess we got him, huh?" And Little Tree thought to himself, "We?" He said, "Thank ye, Grandpa. Thank ye." Grandpa said, "Okay, Grandma." And Little Tree was up, flying down the path towards the cabin, half a mile away. He ran so fast his feet did not touch the ground. Or so it seemed. And when he got to the cabin, he flung himself inside. Onto the floor he fell, and Grandma, who was washing the dishes, looked over to him and said 2 words. She said, "What? Where?" And she flew out the door. And over her shoulder she cried out, "Bring the dogs!" And little Tree got up and went to the door and saw Grandma headed down that path. And surely her feet were definitely not touching the ground. Little Tree went and got the dogs. By the time they got down to the river, Grandma had Grandpa on the crook of her arm. And she now had the hand in her mouth. And she was sucking and spitting and sucking and spitting and sucking and spitting out that poison. And then she saw Little Tree. She said, "Make a fire, quickly. It's getting late. We're going to be here all night." And so Little Tree went to the birch and took the birch bark off. Grandpa had taught him that that was the best and easiest way to make a fire. So he made a fire. Grandpa said, "Make another one by his feet." And so he did. And then Grandma took out that leather pouch where she had all the herbs and the roots from the forest that she used for healing. And she boiled them in a pot over that fire. And she made a poultice, a bandage, for Grandpa's hand. And now Grandpa was hallucinating. And he talked about how he was a boy again. He was 10 years old. He was running through the woods with his father, hunting and playing. He was absolutely making no sense at all. Grandma said, "All night we will be here and the dogs will surround us for protection." And she assigned the dogs locations to sit. And then she took off practically all of her clothing and put them on Grandpa. And Little Tree did the same. And then they cuddled up together, the three, nesting like spoons in a drawer at home. And the dogs took their positions. And Grandpa kept on mumbling. Little Tree finally, out of sheer exhaustion, fell asleep. Several hours later, the rooster reminded us that the sun was coming up. Little Tree's eyes popped open. He looked around, and there was nobody there. And then he heard screaming and yelling, and he thought the worst. And he ran down to the river where the noises were coming from. And there was Grandpa and Grandma and the dogs splashing, jumping in the water. Grandpa was going to be all right. And Little Tree jumped right in the water, clothes and all. And they were all so happy that they did the Cherokee happy dance. Well, 2 weeks later, Little Tree and Grandpa going for a walk. And Little Tree had that hand in his. And as they walked down that path, Little Tree looked at the fang marks now, scars that were on Grandpa's hand. And he thought to himself, "Why, Grandpa, he must love me more than anybody else on earth, except for maybe Grandma." And he thought about what a good man he was. And he thought about how he wanted to be a good man. So he said to Grandpa, he said, "Grandpa, am I going to be a good man when I grow up?" And Grandpa said, "I don't know." And Little Tree was shocked, devastated. And Grandpa saw that. So he said, "You see, Little Tree, inside of each of us live two wolves. One wolf is good, it It is kind, it is generous, it is giving, it is sharing, it is loving. The other is a bully. The other is mean, unkind, selfish, greedy, angry, violent. And these two wolves are constantly contending with one another. And the one that wins will determine the kind of person you become. The little tree said, well, how do I know which one is going to win? And grandfather said, that much I can tell you. The one that wins will be the one that you feed. Now, before I leave you today, I want you all to think about the hands of love that are in your lives. Or the ones that were in your lives. You know, the ones that made the bed, made the breakfast. The ones that did the laundry, mopped the floors. The ones that went to work to make a living, to support the family. The ones that held the bike so you could learn to ride. The ones that picked you up so that you could put an ornament on the highest limb of the Christmas tree. The ones that swung you around and said, whoopee! These are the hands of love that are in your lives. And they may not have protected you from a rattlesnake, but surely they have given you so much. So maybe before this day is over, we can all look for those hands of love that are in our lives and say, thank you. Thank you.